My name is Sean Ade. I'm the director of the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. I'm also a professor here at GW in the School of Media and Public Affairs. And I'm very happy to welcome you to our third annual Roberts Lecture with Ambassador Tom Pickering. Very briefly, I want to say something about the man for whom this lecture is named, Dr. Walter Roberts, who's sitting here in the front row. Walter was one of the original Voice of America broadcasters in World War II and then began a long career at the State Department. I could not list all of his accomplishments, nor our speakers' accomplishments, and still have time for the event, but I do want to point out a couple of things. In 1960, he was appointed Counselor for Public Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade. And in 1971, he was named Associate Director of the U.S. Information Agency. And his book, Tito, Mihailovich, and the Allies, 1941 and 1945, was hailed by Foreign Affairs as the best book on the subject, and I've read it. It's quite wonderful. It's written in 1973, I believe. It holds up extremely well. And Walter also has a special place in GW's heart because Mickey East, who's here in the front row, when he was dean of the Elliott School, hired Walter to teach what we believe was the first class in public diplomacy at an American university. So we are grateful to both of you. And Walter is was an extremely popular professor and is still one of the more popular guest speakers in our various public diplomacy classes that we teach here at GW. Walter also is the reason why we're here because it was the endowment in his name that founded what was then called the Public Diplomacy Institute and now is the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. Ambassador Thomas Pickering has had a very long and distinguished career in public service. Among other things, we were joking today that he seems to have been the ambassador to everywhere. In his 4-decade-long career in the Foreign Service, he's been the ambassador to Russia, India, the United Nations, Israel, El Salvador, Nigeria, and Jordan. He also served as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 1997 to 2000, a particularly interesting time, as I think will come up in the discussion. He holds the rank of Career Ambassador, the highest in the U.S. Foreign Service. At present, he's affiliated with, among others, the International Crisis Group and oversees their international actions as co-chair. He's also chairman of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, chairman of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, and chairman of the American Academy of Diplomacy. He also serves on the board of directors for CRDF Global and the American Iranian Council, an organization devoted to the normalization of relations between the United States and Iran. And of course, in 2012, along with former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, he helped lead a State Department-sponsored panel investigating the recent attack on the U.S. Diplomatic Commission in Benghazi. Before we get started, I want to welcome also Tara Sonnensheim, the former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, and last year's Roberts Lecture speaker. And now a fellow at SMPA, I should add.
Thank you. I will be very brief in thanking everyone for coming, but to say one quick sentence about Tom Pickering, followed by a quick announcement about Tom Pickering. The sentence is really a word, and it's service. This is a man who has served, not only, as you heard, in so many diplomatic posts in the Navy, has served in communities and countries, but tonight we really honor him for extraordinary service. And my announcement is that as a recovering journalist, I never miss a story. And today is November 5th, and it is Ambassador Pickering's birthday. So would you join me? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Ambassador Pickering. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you, dear. Thank you all very much. You ought to really get together as a choir.
Maybe not.
With Frank in charge.
Maybe not. Well, welcome, Ambassador Pickering. I'm Frank Sesno. I'm the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs. I was for many years a correspondent with CNN, and before that with the Associated Press, and before that with the Voice of America. And I would be remiss if I did not start by adding my thanks, kudos, and congratulations to Walter for being here, for enabling these events. Look at the crowd here. This is phenomenal. They get better every year. And for saying that what you helped build at the Voice of America and the influence that it and you have had is something that really is a great tribute to the men and women who work there, to the democracy and freedom that it represents, and to the information that it has helped to spread throughout the decades. So, Walter, thank you very much. I truly can think of no greater life's calling or legacy than this beacon, which the Voice of America has been for millions and millions of people who have not gotten access to free and accurate information over the years, or a greater tribute to the United States of America for what this country stands for. So again, I also have to say that for those of you who are standing, there are seats down here. So there are some empty seats, so please come down and make yourselves comfortable. If you're in the right seat, you know, you get free popcorn or something. Also, in my capacity over the years, I can tell you that when I covered the White House for many, many years, Ambassador Pickering came through on more than one occasion. The work I did down in Central America during the dark years there were, and elsewhere, his name and his service, as Tara Sonnenschein says, really shone through. And I'll start with the first question. We're also going to open it up to yours. But before I do that, I also want to thank Tara for being a fellow here at the School of Media and Public Affairs. Her work with our students has been phenomenal, and so it's a great pleasure. Ambassador Pickering, happy birthday.
Thank you, Frank.
I can think of no better way for you to spend it than here with us tonight.
My only comment is I've now reached the age where I'd rather subtract than add.
Well, I think you're doing just fine.
That's what the man said going past the 26th floor of the Empire State Building.
We're calling this Beyond Benghazi.
Great.
So let's not go beyond it too fast. But to start with a question to you about Benghazi, how much damage it has done, both reputationally and on the ground in country. We'll leave the politics to the side for the moment, but let me just, as you have looked at this, what has this meant for us?
Well, thank you, Frank. Before I do that, I have to join others in first saying that Walter has been an outstanding communicator, but in many ways a communicator whose real effect, as you said, and as Tara said, has influenced the lives of many people around the world. So many that he will not know and we will not know. But he can take great satisfaction in knowing that that uncountable number in large measure was influenced by him, by the reputation of VOA in those days, by the sense that honesty and truth were the hallmark, and we have to get back there. And I thank you, Frank, for certainly being here, Walter for allowing me to be here in his name, if I could put it that way. It's an honor. And thank you, Tara, very much for your one-word introduction and your very clever sleuthing. But I'm pleased. Benghazi was a blow. It was a blow that was amplified, unfortunately, by the prurient nature of American domestic politics at the time it occurred. And that added, put it this way, catastrophe to tragedy. And it was not in that sense anything that we recognized as one of those great moments. And Chris Smith had worked for me for 2 years as a friend and a colleague. And so for me, it was even more than a tragedy in the particular personal sense. And when I was asked to take over the leadership of this particular Accountability Review Board, there were two things that made a difference. One, the Secretary asked me, and when the Secretary asks, you come. But even more importantly, a friend had died tragically under circumstances that deserve never to be repeated. And the purpose of the Accountability Review Board was to do everything we could to see that those kinds of mistakes which led to this tragic set of circumstances would not be repeated. Finally, it was a unique situation in a sense that it differed from all but 3 or 4 other places where we were present in its temporary nature, in its hand-to-mouth existence, in its uncertain support, and indeed in the willingness to trust that because nothing had happened, nothing would ever happen. And we know that those are not the ways in which one deals with service overseas in dangerous areas in particular, and not the ways in which a great institution like the Department of State should perform in dealing with its own people, and particularly those who experience special danger. We made a series of quite harsh findings. I have never been told that people thought that our findings were either irrelevant, unimportant, or exaggerated. The hardest was that we found 4 people who made decisions and took on leadership roles in which they obviously represented people who failed in carrying out at least their responsibilities with respect to Benghazi. And that was never easy and always hard. But we all felt that, unlike other review boards, it was not possible for us in these special circumstances to dodge the bullet, if I could put it that way. And I think clearly that has been the case. I despair and rue the day that this has become the subject of what is clearly the worst kind of partisan strife. I had the responsibility of defending this report in public once it was impugned by generalizations without, in my view, substance. I believe in the testimony that I gave, and indeed the defense that I put in, that I did my best to explain what motivated us and why, and what were the circumstances that led to our conclusions. I still have not seen, but I may be undertaking the peculiar blindness of too close as an association, anything that I would consider a serious fault, although I began my various testimonies by saying no one is perfect, and all of us who participated in this would welcome anything new which cast light on the situation, which would help the State Department do what we struggled to do, which was to provide them with advice and ideas that would perhaps best equip them not to ever see this happen again. Further deponent saith not.
Well, let me ask you a couple things, and starting with that. What did we learn? What has been changed to either make this not happen again or dramatically reduce the odds of this happening again?
We learned that there should be no exceptions to the rules for dealing with security. We learned that where situations required our presence and we could not immediately meet the standards, we had to develop a plan, a commitment, the funding, and the leadership to make it right as rapidly as possible. We learned that we had to be alert to intelligence which crept in over a long period of time, but which in the aggregate showed the kind of deterioration that we easily saw with Monday morning quarterbacking but seemed to have escaped the people who were supposed to be watching. We learned that security has responsibilities not just with the professionals, but by the people in the State Department who represent and speak for our overseas posts and people. And that cannot be escaped, just as ambassadors cannot escape the peculiar assignment of responsibility to them for security. We learned that money was thought to be no object in providing for Benghazi, but in the end, unfortunately, it was. We learned, interestingly enough, that the embassies in Egypt and Tunisia, under much heavier assault, stood up beautifully without even the intervention of local authorities. But we also learned that in a place like Benghazi, where local authority was particularly absent, and indeed individual militias, and there were large numbers of them, carried weapons and exercised authority as they moved around, the danger was particularly acute. We learned that when you plan a set of facilities to resist bombing, you take on a special responsibility also to overcome the disadvantages that brings you with armed assault. We learned that, in fact, fire is a weapon, and that fire and security have never been coordinated to the degree that they must be. And so the security protection overlooked the fire danger, and fire was the killer. And we should never be in a position where we occupy buildings and build security arrangements, even jerry-rigged, that did not provide for that. And I won't bore you with all the rest, but those are the ones that kind of stick in my head as being some of the most important things we were concerned about.
They're huge, and some of them are what we might call situational.
Yes,
But
very.
others are, pardon the expression, but structural. I mean, when one thinks about...
Others, Frank, in retrospect, are common sense.
Yes.
And somehow, over a long period of time. Now, it is true that most terrorist attacks seek to exploit weaknesses. It was not hard to figure out what the weakness was. Too big a compound, too few people protecting it, and too open to entry.
You pointed out that you rued the partisanship that intruded on this. And I'm sure many of you remember some of the media coverage, which was some of the most remarkable stuff I've ever seen in terms of what I consider to have been over-the-top response to this event. But there was
much of it qualified for a peculiar Pulitzer Prize in creative fiction.
Well, in some ways it was...
Frank, I accumulated every newspaper report the State Department could find.
As part of your study.
The stack of paper was this high. As a matter of obligation, I read every one because I wanted to know what people thought happened.
Right.
And I wanted to know what the answer was to what people thought happened in terms of what really took place.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you that about 80% of this may have been in good faith put forward, but was made up out of people's experience in other situations which they tried to generalize to Benghazi and had no relationship to the facts.
You saw stuff that was just flat out, absolute, totally wrong.
Totally wrong, and it became the object of campaigns.
Well, it picked up in the echo chamber. And
Exactly,
went on
went
television
round
and
and
radio.
round. And honest and good people were writing me saying, well, you must have known this, this, and this, and there was never any scintilla of evidence that anything they had to say had any relationship to what happened.
Has there been appropriate accountability for what went wrong?
Yes, there has been.
What about, and I said I'd put the politics to the side for the moment, but let me bring them in now. What about those who say that this could be a very substantial point of vulnerability for Hillary Clinton should she run for president?
Well, I mean, obviously that and the president were the two main objects of attack. And we reviewed very carefully what they did, and how they operated. And we believed they were not, in that sense, responsible. And in the law that sets up the Accountability Review Board, there was a specific provision that said, please, in the future, do not find heads of agencies responsible because of their position, but go to where the decisions were made that actually influenced the situation and where they were reviewed. And that's precisely what we did. And we looked very carefully. Now, everybody in a senior position bears a set of responsibilities. But the law in specific terms told us that we must find responsibility where the decision-making took place and where that particular decision-making was reviewed. And that was very clearly, from every bit of evidence we collected, at the level in which we fixed it in the report.
Let me ask you one last question on this, and then I want to move on to other things. In terms of the consequences and implications on the ground in the region, what have they been?
Consequences and implications on the ground in the region have, I think, certainly been some diminution of respect for the United States, in part because, in fact, we were caught short. We were caught short in both facilities, interestingly enough. And both facilities had different measures of protection. And interestingly enough, in the tragic circumstances, 2 individuals died in both facilities. It is also clear that for Al-Qaeda and the terrorist crowd, this represented a victory. And we don't need those kinds of things, not with respect to our reputation, even more with respect to our people and the facilities. And we should not be in the business of putting people in places that were so open to vulnerabilities. And happily, a large majority of our facilities are well protected. But our first and most important recommendation was that the recommendations of the accountability report led by Bill Crow for Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, for the construction of 10 well-protected embassies and consulates a year, had dwindled to 3.
To 3.
As a result of cuts, of cost growth, and indeed just inability to continue to keep the Congress's nose in this problem, if I could put it that way. And we said, you've got to go back and you've got to do a 10-year program and bring up the facilities that are clearly, if I could put it this way, underweight up to standard.
This raises a broader problem.
And we said it's starting now, it's $2.1 billion a year to do that. That's big money for the State Department.
Big money. This raises a much broader challenge, it seems. And this is a good forum to talk about it. The Institute for Public Diplomacy, the job Kara had, the jobs you have had as an ambassador and a diplomat over the years. You've got these intense and horrible discussions and decisions built around security on the one hand, and you've got the job to know and to be part of a country, and sometimes hostile country, on the other. Do you worry that our diplomacy becomes increasingly something that exists on the other side of the moat?
Yes.
How do you broach that?
Well, I think that there are 3 pieces here that bother me. One is that Washington is increasingly, in my view, out of touch with what's going on, because the field is...
I think you could stop right there. Increasingly stuck with what's going on, yes.
Yeah. No, the field is now increasingly populated with political appointees and people who have not had overseas experience.
And at more levels than
a
before?
group of us wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post 2 months ago, and a story in the Foreign Service Journal. In part, there's this kind of natural accretion. Every administration wants their own people in the key jobs. And their people are not necessarily the people who've spent their life in the field understanding what's going on. So there is a kind of problem of relevancy to what is the local situation, and the ambassadors are supposed to be in charge of dealing with that, but they're less and less listened to, I find. The second piece that I think is important is that we have in some ways, less capacity to listen to what foreign governments are thinking and saying, even though we report it intensively. And the third, in my view, is that we need to fight the continued struggle of making our public diplomacy relevant to our policy and vice versa. The integration, if I could put it this way, of USIA was seen to have one potential advantage, that deputy assistant secretaries in the regional bureau would be from the public diplomacy range, and they would work with the assistant secretary on the policy. It didn't mean that the policies had to be made for public sale, but it meant that experts in being able to explain the policy would have a lot to say about how the policy was put together, but even more presented. Now, my own view is it is best to tell the truth and tell the story as much as you can when you're putting policy forward. Otherwise, spin doesn't have any persistence, and it has an undermining capacity. And that's very simple stuff, but it goes a long way, in my view, in effective public diplomacy. But I see those 3 points as areas where we could certainly help to pull up our socks.
Your first ambassadorial position was where?
Jordan,
In what year?
1898. 1974 to 1978 and a half.
So from 1974, when you communicated back to Washington, how did you do that?
By cable.
How long did it take to have a round trip?
By cable? Speed of light.
Okay. When you communicated to the public, if you were communicating to the public and you spoke to a newspaper or whatever, how fast did that move?
6 to 24 hours.
If you were overseas today and you were tweeting or you had your own social media page or somebody else would be, that would be speed of light
Yes.
all the time.
Yep. Full-time speed of light.
How has this media and
I
digital
guess you have
media-
to say delayed or relayed a little bit by speed of brain.
I think speed of light and speed of media exceeds speed of brain.
Oh, way
too
ahead.
often. How has this changed the job?
Changed the job because the goldfish bowl has gotten more translucent. It means, in effect, that you're expected, if not required, to respond often before you know all the facts. And that's hard. And to some extent, you have to develop a mechanism and a way to do that. You have to be sure that people know that this is your first reaction, that you're looking into it. Here's what I think now, but this could be
Now, are you talking responding back to Washington, sort of official
Both.
channels, or to the public?
Both.
So you have to do both
both.
simultaneously,
Well, almost. You
instantaneously?
can't do both simultaneously, but you have to try at least to stay up, and you have staff to help you do this. And I think that that's all very important.
What I'm
The
hearing-
other thing you have to be aware of is that everybody else is operating at the speed of light. And the number of points of light that impinge on your work has multiplied. And you have to figure out which ones you address and how. And you could spend your whole time and your whole staff's time sitting there in the embassy responding to speed of light stuff, whereas the bulk of your job should be out talking to people.
So in a time of Twitter and YouTube, and we've had all these YouTube videos out of Syria and other places,
Everybody.
what is the role for international broadcasting, for the voice of America?
I think it's 2 pieces. One, to continue to do the best job in broadcasting that they can, even if in some cases the audience has become more selective, more self-selective, more limited perhaps. People will look at that. I think secondly, we need to expand that to the video realm. Thirdly, we need to expand that essentially to the social media realm, so that we now have a nexus of media that is widely ramified and very open. My own feeling was years ago when Al Jazeera started, and we spent the first 10 years of Al Jazeera fighting it, which was, in my view, stupid. What we should have done is leaned on our good friends, the Qataris, and said, we're assigning a team of 8 Americans who speak fluent Arabic and who will be available to you 24 hours a day in shifts. And we expect at least 15 minutes, but regularly an hour, at some reasonable time, to comment on your content in Arabic from the American perspective. It would have helped us enormously to move in that
Do you
direction.
think there's any chance they would have said thank you to that?
No. But I'm not sure that at that stage they had the capacity to resist something.
So in an age of Al Jazeera and Russia Today and CCTV and Deutsche Welle and all these global
Sure.
broadcasts, and at a time of YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and all this global social media, can a Voice of America, a Radio Free Europe, the traditional types of voices and broadcasts that emanated from this country that once stood alone essentially with the BBC as the only alternatives to suppressed information, can they still have that influence?
Frank, not in the same old way. We obviously have to transform.
Do we need them? Do we even need them?
Well, in some cases, we need something that can, in effect, be our voice, and we've done some of this, in all of the media. And the nexus of that may be VOA, but it has to be VOA on steroids, upgraded for modernity, and focused on a lot of new media. And to some extent, that may not be easy, or necessarily something that comes immediately to hand, and the funding problem of that may be large, and the personnel problem. Some of that's been done, and Tara should be up here explaining it. I'm the one who has a bunch of crazy ideas which she's probably seen, implemented, or rejected 1,000 times over.
I've never heard her refer to any of your ideas as crazy.
Well, she's kind.
No, but it really is a fascinating, it is a fascinating
It's a great subject.
because do we have a special place as a country wrapping our arms around more credible information? How do we tell the story and the perspective of our policy and our prerogatives? How do we reach people who are still bombarded with bad information or horribly slanted information?
It gets harder and harder because there's no garbage filter. The only thing that I can suggest is that the First Amendment is based on the competition in news between different points of view, presumably fully respecting a single factual basis. That's now been destroyed. We have multiple factual bases. Some of them, as I say, deeply bordering into fiction. And so we have a multiple responsibility as much as we possibly can. To some extent, it may be that we should seek persuasive participants. Over the years, VOA and its predecessors, and indeed American media, had rock stars. Here sits one.
Oh, yeah.
Here sits one. No, I used to listen to you overseas long after I left the UN as one of the great exponents of UN's foibles and successes. And it was very important. And to many people, I think the failure to appreciate the value of the UN was the failure of the American media to either understand it or try to produce something, as you did, that was both reliable, dependable in the long term, and succinct enough to be captured. And I knew that you were engaged in a struggle in many ways, perhaps more with your producers than anything else. But it represented, in my view, a significant example of what one could do And I think we need to find a way, as we've said before, I've said to you before, to move that more broadly, horizontally, into other areas of media, and seek to try to do that by establishing authoritative voices, by establishing facts as much as we can, but raising the level of reportage and analysis as much as we can.
It's hard to-
Quality, in my view, still helps.
It does.
I think one of the values of Al Jazeera was they saw a niche and tried to fill it. My own sense was that often they were irritating. Often they picked, to put it this way, scabs. But to some extent, that represented a new way to approach hegemonic powers. And we had to come and defend ourselves. And I think it took a long while, and it was a difficult approach, and I don't think we're there.
And just to put a button on this, they had and have an important audience.
They do.
And engaging
Very
that
much.
audience is critical.
And that's why, in fact, I wanted to piggyback first on them.
Well, actually, it's going to be very interesting. Tomorrow I'm going, and I mentioned this to Sean and the faculty earlier, but tomorrow I'm going into Al Jazeera America to do something there. And
Great.
I'm quite fascinated to see
Well,
how they operate and how they
It's
reach.
one of the places where I struggle to go if I get invited.
Oh, well, come along. We'll go together. We'll see what we can do. Let me touch on a couple other things, and then I'd like to open it up to your questions. First, Iran. This is something you're working on. We have a new Iranian president. This has been the pressure point. My first big assignment overseas,
Really?
my first big assignment overseas was really big, was standing on the tarmac at Wiesbaden as our hostages came off the plane from Algeria, having all that work by Warren Christopher and others, one by one. And here we are all these years later, and they still gather in Iran, maybe with less passion now, to chant death to America and to visit the den of spies. What do you expect from the new Iranian president?
Well, interestingly enough, they still do that. 3 days before that, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, went on the media and said, I want you Iranians to support my delegation negotiating disarmament with the Americans.
So?
So, is there a change? Look, I think so. The truth will come out in the negotiations. But there certainly is enough evidence. Rouhani, along with the other 5 candidates, were all special assistants to the supreme leader. He knew who he was picking. Rouhani, interestingly enough, knew enough of what public sentiment was on Iran to run on a different kind of platform, a platform that said Iran has to be back in the middle of the international community, and it's been marginalized and pushed out. And that means we have to deal with America. Now, if somebody had told me in July the next president of Iran in September would be advocating negotiations with America directly, and that we had to get together and find ways to, in effect, look at their nuclear program from both perspectives. The other thing that's been very interesting is the Iranians have put on the table a series of proposals, and their foreign minister said to me on September 21st that we're tired of being in the doghouse. We're tired of you taking all the initiatives. We're moving. We're putting initiatives on the table. We want you to respond. We want to change the equation. And they did. They put on the table a series of proposals that had I been designing them for the United States, I would have said were not attainable. Now we have the big problem of deciding how and in what way are we going to shift the sanctions business, which helped to put the pressure on to get us here, but now it has to do the double duty. It has to be the quid pro quo for fashioning the agreement, which I believe has a real chance of working, which in effect will limit and circumscribe their nuclear program.
You believe that has a real chance of working?
I do.
What I just heard you say.
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure it has a real chance of working in the Congress. That's what I'm most worried about. I'm not worried at this stage so much about what the Iranians put on the table. Someone once said, you know, there are two kinds of fooling. One, something you say you never have to be responsible for, but the other is something you say where you're responsible to your own public. And Rouhani was elected by the Iranian public on the first ballot. 70% voted and 52% voted for him. But he's now put on the table a series of measures in which, if he fails, he'll have to answer to the Iranian public, and he's acutely aware of this.
Do you think this change that you detect is out of exhaustion? I mean, right, we often say the Persians invented chess. They're playing chess. They plan 6 moves ahead. Out of exhaustion with the sanctions and trying to outmaneuver the sanctions, or that there is some kind of fundamental, maybe even generational shift that we are seeing?
No, how can you say it's a generational
Younger
shift
not at
with
the
Ali,
leadership level.
with Ali Khamenei? What I'm saying, however, is that it is the failure of past policies, including Ahmadinejad's, to challenge everything in sight, while at the same time, as you may have detected, he was behind the scenes the biggest advocate of rapprochement with the United States.
As you well
Because he saw that as a political way to proceed, and so did the Supreme Leader, who didn't want Ahmadinejad as the next Supreme Leader.
So as you recall, the last time there was a reformist president, this country and President Clinton reached out. Madeleine Albright actually offered an apology to the Iranians.
I was there when we were doing it.
Okay. And what happened? The Supreme Leaders smashed the reformist president, and nothing happened.
Both Rafsanjani and Khatami suffered from a Supreme Leader who, in my view, was nervous about their taking over his job.
And now that's not the case?
No, because he picked the 6 former special assistants who he knew for a long period of time and understood that they would be part of his move. But he also had to decide to accept the will of the people. And the will of the people was expressed around a political program presented to them in the election of change.
So this could be
And
something.
the Iranians are very worried that we cannot respond, and that if they make no progress, they're down the tubes. They're toast.
I want to go to your questions for a few minutes, but I'm going to do one more before then, because this one all right. You get a call from the White House. They say, Ambassador, boy, do we need you back in service. Now, we're going to send you to Moscow because this guy Putin's given us a real pain. And you have your first meeting with President Putin. And Snowden's somewhere over there, and the demonstrators are, you know, they've got the gang of 12 that they're going to throw in jail for God knows how long and all these things. What do you say to Vladimir Putin?
No thank you to the job. I've been there and done it. What I think, however, the guy they pick should say to Putin
He's very good, isn't he?
is, this won't wash. You're not, in effect, doing anything that in the long run is improving the direction of your country, or even, in my view, serving in a useful way to support you in charge of your country.
People have said, he's been told this in various ways.
He has.
But it hasn't changed a thing.
No, and I'm not sure it will, although endless repetition has its uses.
What would you say to him?
I would say, I think you're floundering. You're losing traction. You haven't done what your people expect, and you haven't done what you intend to do, is to make Russia a strong international player.
You would really say that to him in those words?
I would.
To his face?
One-on-one.
What do you think he would say in response?
You're out of your mind. I know best how to run this country.
To which you would respond?
Take a look at what's going on. You need to know.
Fascinating. Let's open to some questions from the floor here. This is a...
Of course, I wouldn't enter into a dialogue like that, but I would seek over a period of time to get there, and it wouldn't be the first time.
How much
But it is important. Ambassadors
have
can
leverage,
serve
and they
useful
have that
purposes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes they get thrown out, and sometimes that's worthwhile.
I know. Who has a question? PJ. If you don't know, ladies and gentlemen, PJ Crowley is also affiliated with us here at the School of Media and Public Affairs. PJ, let's get your mic.
PJ is no stranger to the microphone.
And like you, happy not to have to face one every day. um, Tom, let me tease you out about the relationship between diplomacy and public diplomacy. You very intriguingly said part of the decision-making process has to be crafting the story that you're going to present based on the decision that you make. So take a situation like we face in Egypt today. From a diplomatic standpoint, our posture in terms of investing in the only institution in Egypt that is strong enough to move the country forward is a perfect logic. But in making the difficult decision not to call it a coup, and with the secretary there over the weekend, suggesting that Egypt's on a path to democracy, even as it tries to exterminate the Muslim Brotherhood, how do you balance those two where, on the one hand, one is realpolitik and makes sense, on the other hand, not calling it a coup destroys, at least for a period of time, the credibility of the story that the United States is interested in democracy in that part of the world?
I think that we were in a peculiar disadvantage by our own legislation in having to identify it as a coup. I would have sought some other words, which we did, and I would have said, frankly, it's too important to Egyptian-U.S. relationships to accept the legally devastating results of calling it a coup. And therefore, I believe that there's been a change of government. It's been precipitous and go through all of that. But I would say I need to defend our policy against critical actions taken with automaticity by peculiar findings. And that's not going to be easy, but I think I do that. I would think that were I the secretary, whenever you tell Sisi or the bunch, the notion you have to come out and pat them on the back for creating a wonderful democracy is, in my view, still fails the credibility test in a serious way. I would say, look, they're going to hold elections. We think they can make progress, but it's not a sure thing. And I encourage Sisi and everybody else to have open elections with broad candidacies and with a fair effort to keep them honest and all those things that we stand for. And I think I would have put it down on that level, PJ, rather than to try to elevate it to a kind of bumper sticker that wouldn't stick.
Okay, another question.
Now, it's easy to say this after the fact, but to some extent, you and I know secretaries are paid and press advisors are paid to see bad bumper stickers coming.
Gentleman in the back.
Ambassador, I was wondering.
Why don't you try to keep that a little bit, so maybe we'll avoid the feedback.
further down?
Also, if you could tell us your name and your affiliation, that'd be great.
My name's Tom Dernbach. My name's Tom Dernbach. I'm a graduate of the Corbell School of International Relations. I was wondering, with the president having to cancel 2 trips to Asia now due to domestic politics, do you know of anything that would be able to help reassure nations in that region that we're still going to be doing our pivot, quote unquote, to Asia? Or is there any sort of advice you would give to the president to reassure the nations in the region?
Tom, a couple of things. This is a quibble and a side piece, but I think the pivot was a badly chosen phrase. Pivot usually means you're swinging away from something and towards something. And there was no question at all that we were deeply engaged in the Middle East and highly unlikely to disengage. And that every European was constantly watching for where America was going. And it was gratuitous and unnecessary to do that. Secondly, I think that the president's judgment that he should stay home in a time of shutdown was probably right. But it didn't help us in foreign policy terms, and it made it clear that domestic politics could continue, even in malign ways, to cripple foreign policy objectives, interests, and developments. My own view is the president should have come back and picked the next 2 or 3 meetings to make sure in private communications with other people that he was committed to attend. And if he could find one he was not going to go to in Asia and swing himself around to do that, it would have been important as a way of trying to right what was otherwise a lurching ship at that time. I think that more than just the fact of our attending is the central opportunity the president gets to meet with a serious number of international players who count on those meetings because he can't travel continuously, as ways to get caught up and indeed understand where we intend to go. And the feedback from those meetings is tremendously important, particularly for the president in shaping his sense of the individuals he's dealing with, what the issues they have with the United States, and where he would like to see things move. And I think they're critically valuable in that sense. So I would not want to sacrifice it. I think finally, the sense that the world's greatest power in military, economic, and what I would call political values terms is suddenly crippled by essentially a embarrassing wrangle of party politics at the lowest level of mud wrestling is unseemly but demeaning. And it's conveyed a message to people that we can't manage our affairs, and that Americans are deeply divided, and that they're prepared in many ways to hazard the world leadership which has devolved on them since 1945 in a silly spat over a set of domestic issues that, whatever we may think, don't deserve that kind of treatment. And so I regret it. I think it's a bad thing to happen. I'm not sure a president could get away with going despite the shutdown. I just don't think that's possible. But he ought to make some effort, one, first to avoid that again, and secondly, to seek to find a way, if I could put it this way, to rewrite the balance. Over a period of time, if we continue to do things well and right, these sillinesses go by the board. If we don't, they add up, and they become a cumulative checklist of things that people will now continue to believe we are in a serious decline. I don't believe that. That we can't handle our domestic affairs. There is signs of that. That we are not prepared to step up to the plate to deal with our own problems. And that's a serious question. And that we are, if I could be cautious here, in the business of making promises internationally we can't keep. Thank you for your question.
When you speak of making internationally making promises we can't keep, what tops that list?
Cairo speech. Up till now. I mean, he is the rest of the term. And I admire John Kerry and what he's trying to do on Palestinian-Israeli peace. And my sense is that the most formidable decision was to keep it to such a small group that so far he's been able to keep this question under wraps.
Under wraps?
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's critically important. And I would not guess, but I have sense from people in the region that that means that at least things are moving rather than, as we have seen, constantly blown up by the bickering parties before they ever get off.
Back to the audience for a question. In the back. Mike is coming your way.
I can project. Thank you for coming to take the time to speak with us today. My name is Stephanie. I'm with the Foreign Service. I am a public diplomacy officer. I'm interested in the upcoming summit in Vilnius and the possibility for Ukraine to sign an agreement with the EU. I'm interested to know how you think President Putin will react and if you think it will bring him further support or dissent in Russia.
I think that unlike NATO, where I see little chance of early movement on Ukraine, that there is a good possibility and reason for Ukraine to move into the, at least into the economic area, if not full membership. And I think that ought to be encouraged. And in many ways, the Russians for years sat back and relaxed. Admittedly, in my experience in Russia, as I traveled around, I never met a Russian who didn't have a cousin who was married to a Ukrainian. And I never met a Ukrainian who spoke Ukrainian, and there's a difference there, who didn't tell me immediately about 400 years of Russian occupation. And that may sound silly, but it gets to the heart of the issue. And so, in effect, for Russians, it's like cutting off a piece of the body, and very hard to accept, particularly dear Ukraine. On the other hand, over a period of time, they have come to grips with the idea that Ukraine and its economy are different than Ukraine and its army. And I think that we ought to try to hold them to that distinction as much as we can, if in fact, after all, the president of Ukraine was once a close creature of Putin's, decides to continue to pursue this direction and move. And Putin won't like it.
Right.
And Putin has found that his major weapon in retaliating against Ukraine has been gas. And the major problem is that the gas lines still to Europe are heavily through Ukraine. So the Ukrainians have invented the wonderful idea that any cuts get passed on. And Putin hasn't figured out how to cut it all off. So I think there's some balancing here. Besides, Mr. Putin, at least momentarily, is on a good boy kick.
For the time. Let me go to another question, if I may. This one's from Bruce Gregory. Is Bruce in the room? I saw Bruce. Hi, Bruce. Do you want to do this or you want me to? All right. Bruce writes, I'm happy for you to do it, but Bruce writes, with great precision. In 1997, you were Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, state's top career diplomat, and a key advisor to Secretary Madeleine Albright on President Clinton's announced plan to put public diplomacy, development, and arms control in a reinvented State Department. You urged as a governing principle that all of states' undersecretaries would act as a corporate board. They would make strategic planning recommendations, but decision-making authority and resource management would be pushed down to the assistant secretaries. This is why we love Bruce Gregory. He works for us. Okay? State adopted this corporate board model. When USIA was integrated in 1998, its activities were decentralized throughout the department. In 2009, however, as vice chairman of the Advisory Committee on Transformational Diplomacy, you urged Secretary Rice to create a semi-autonomous agency for global public engagement under a director reporting directly to the Secretary of State. This agency would have direct line authority over all State Department public diplomacy personnel. In effect, it would recreate a single public diplomacy agency within state. Why did you call for a corporate board model in 1997 and a semi-autonomous agency model in 2009? What led you to change your mind?
Great questions. First, there are two pieces there. USIA. I had always believed that the Defense Department model of having agencies within the ambit of the Secretary and the Defense Department, but operating independently with what one would call full resources. That is, a budget, personnel authorities, those kinds of things, made a lot of sense, particularly because traditional diplomacy and public diplomacy are different. They're matched in some ways, and they have to work together. But just like AID, which is a heavy program agency, traditional foreign service officers were not uniquely suited to move back and forth in that realm. And I felt the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency could go either way, although I thought that one way to keep it in keeping with the original founding idea that we needed an independent agency to promote arms control and disarmament was not necessarily a bad thing. So I made my own recommendations, which failed in 97. And with the new opportunity and not having changed my mind in 2009, I continued to make that recommendation with the glorious result that, of course, it's been totally ignored on both ends. I'm not sure you can stick me with the idea that the undersecretary should be a corporate board. But I'm aging, and my memory, particularly for failures, is very short. So I had a view, without going to this in excruciating detail, that the ideal for the State Department was that the number of functional bureaus should equal the number of regional bureaus, and that we should pull those together that were diversified by common ideas, the way oceans, environment, and science was created under Henry Kissinger. That secondly, we should strive as an ideal for a three-layer cake. The secretary and the undersecretaries and the deputies should all be on one level and make decisions within the area of their responsibilities, except where the secretary and the deputy secretary had taken the issue in their own hands or wanted to supervise it. And that the next level down should be the assistant secretaries, and the deputy assistant secretaries should be extensions, and the next level down should be the country directors and the desks. That, of course, never prospered either. There was too much checking on everybody. Everybody wanted to check. Too many names on the clearances. But over a period of time, I think something like that would help to revolutionize the State Department, and I always thought it made an awful lot of sense.
We've got a few minutes, sir. Let's go up to this question. I think this may be our last one from the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Sorry. My name is Nanaya Obinduro. I'm with the U.S. Air Force. With the it seemed to be like money was like a big problem, or it was a big thing with Benghazi happening. So, with sequestration going on right now, what you see are the chances of, another Benghazi happening somewhere else, and also going off on the experiences of U.S. counter insurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan. What you see will be the future of civil-military relationships.
Gosh, Nana, you've opened a huge door. I think that it's impossible to predict where terrorists might strike as they create the ability for themselves in opening up new places, Yemen, Somalia, maybe Eritrea, and beyond, Nigeria, Mali, Niger, to strike. And it's no longer possible to say that there are certain places in the world which are totally immune. As terrorists begin to look at the weak places and try to organize themselves to move there. Intelligence, in my view, is still the best defense on first line, and strong police work to back it up. And I think that is the way in which we ought to look at the future. Remind me of the second part of your question.
Sequestration.
Sequestration in the State Department. State Department has a total budget, including aid, of $54 billion. That represents a very small percentage of whatever it is, 600 and some billion in the Defense Department.
Yes.
If the State Department's major role is to prevent conflict and the Defense Department's major role is to fight them, we ought to have a little closer coordination between the two. That I worry that after 10 years of conflict, without palpable success in either Iraq or Afghanistan, certainly Iraq is experiencing serious difficulties, and we have a fundamental question whether after 2014 the ANSF will be sufficient to deal with the threat, even backed up by some level of NATO and U.S. support. I think that we have attempted in the last decade to use the military as quick and easy ways to solve diplomatic problems, if there were diplomatic problems. And I think that to some extent Afghanistan was. And I think that having shown, in fact, that it has great combat capacity, but the problem isn't necessarily the end of combat, the problem is what comes after. And neither state, nor aid, nor defense has shown a sufficient capacity to deal with that, and particularly the resurgence of what we would call asymmetrical conflict. That as a diplomat, I have two concerns. I always felt enormously advantaged in every country I was assigned at and every negotiation I was engaged in because of three things. U.S. military supremacy, I can only call it that. American economic strength and vitality, and even after 2008, I think we're there. And our systems of values. I worry because, in fact, we have never confessed or cleaned up how we treated detainees. We have, in effect, not won two wars. We've gone through an economic crisis. I see us coming out. So what have we done? Well, we have undermined, at least in some ways, the strength of our military in terms of the defense needs of the country. And we have undermined our diplomacy in two ways. We became fascinated with military solutions to problems, which meant that diplomacy was disparaged, ignored, downgraded. And many people forget diplomacy was a central feature of arranging greater stability with the Soviet Union at critical times, and it could not be done with military conflict. And so we have lost some of the public trust in diplomacy. And by losing some of the strength of military backing, we have further disadvantaged ourselves at a time when I believe diplomacy is even more important in our future. A growing multipolar world, lots of situations out there that will require, in a sense, a negotiation, compromise, win-win, I hope, but dealing with those issues, and which the threats to our national defense, in my view, have diminished, not raised, despite the threat of terrorism.
I want to follow this up. It's very interesting. In some ways, this is not a new challenge. We've had these, we've turned inward at multiple points in our history. We often say that our best friends are the Atlantic and the Pacific. That doesn't work anymore. We have transnational threats. We talk about information and ideas and bad things happening.
We have a
24/7.
global world and trade
all
and
of that.
all of that.
All of that. We have a polarized Washington, a paralyzed government right now in many ways.
Yes.
How do you, with all of your experience and perspective on this, think that diplomacy and this fundamental role that you talk about that it must play can reassert itself and can, to be a little crass about it, sell itself to the American public, which at the end of the day has to support it?
There are three challenges out there now we have to meet. Iran, and we talked about that. Syria, which in my view is moving toward diplomacy, not away. There's no military solution that I can see close or around the bend. Killing 7,000 people a month is not supportable. The radicalization of both sides, one side by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the other side by Al-Qaeda, is not working to anybody's advantage. And the destabilization of Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and potentially South Turkey ought to worry all players who want to have a stake and an interest in the future. And the third piece is the long-standing, tyrannously difficult problem of Arab-Israeli and now particularly Palestine-Israeli negotiations. None of these is easy. They're all hard as hell. But I don't see another solution, Frank, in any other way to these particular problems. Going to war isn't going to solve it.
But you've got to mobilize government. You talked yourself about the difficulty in convincing Congress.
Sure.
You've got to get the American public not thinking that 25% of our budget is spent
On
on
foreign
foreign aid.
assistance,
Right. All right?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Only through leadership, through constant effort, through hard work. John Kerry has gone out on a hell of a limb. I admire him for it. He's put it this way, his future in terms of risk at a very high level. But if we're not prepared to do that and the president is not prepared to back him up, we don't have a chance. And this is the kind of thing, it requires leadership, it requires commitment, it requires constant work. And if in fact the fates are running against you, and that may well be the case at the moment, then you have to work doubly hard. That's all I can tell you.
I have to get
But
you
one success will, in my view, not turn all of this around, but it will help.
infuse it.
It will give it some legs, some life.
Unfortunately, I have to get you out of here in about 2 minutes, so
Okay.
I want to just do a few things to button this up. You've had an unbelievable career. Your service to this country is off the charts. If you could or had to be ambassador today to any country in the world for reasons of pure personal and professional fascination, or a place where you felt you could make the most difference, what country would that be?
I guess anybody who's been where I have been would have to say China.
Because you think you could make a difference?
I think
Or it's just an amazing place to
it's
be?
an enormously intriguing country from a personal sense. I would feel woefully deficient if I didn't have a top flight staff. But I went from continent to continent, so I know something about that. And it would be a huge learning process and engagement. But all I could say is that sometimes these experiences that you have are transportable.
I imagine you'd have volunteers here who would be that staff.
Absolutely.
I'd like to ask you to address some of the young people in the audience.
Yeah.
Students here who'd like to have a career in foreign service, young people in foreign service who are just starting their careers. What's your advice to them?
My advice is work hard. Do your best to learn as much as you can, not only about your job, but what other people do. Be committed to service, which means don't worry too much about your next assignment. One or two difficult assignments ought to be the challenge you want, not the disaster you might think they could be. And finally, go regularly to church, synagogue, or your mosque and pray for luck.
And your secret to being a strong, influential, and sensitive diplomat is what?
Luck.
Luck?
No. All of my advice to the young people here present is certainly based on what I would hope was my experience.
I would like to say to you that your experience and your service really are off the charts. And the people in this room know that. I hope that the rest of the world knows that, because I think you model the kind of service abroad and here at home that public service really should be
Your
all about.
kindness and flattery embarrass me.
No,
Thank you very much.
It's true. It's true. And we need, and this is my thing, and I'll say this, and I mean this absolutely 100% sincerely. We have a great media in this country. But what we do, and I'll defend it, is we hold people's feet to the fire. But in so doing, maybe we do that a little too much. And we don't understand the depth and the commitment and the sacrifice and the incrementalism and the sheer time and effort it takes to do these jobs. That people who do these jobs are three-dimensional human beings. And that there is a level of complexity and inspiration that goes with stories like this that must be understood.
Thank you, Frank. I always thought that public service was fascinating, that the rewards were not material, but they were certainly in many ways emotional, and that the ability to be near the edge of foreign policy, because no success has a single father, and the ability to attack problems that were coming to you over the transom on a regular basis was some of the most rewarding things. And from time to time, as an ambassador or even as an officer, you have the individual, the capability of helping a single individual who is in strife or difficulty through that particular problem, and that perhaps is even more rewarding in some ways, even though on the scale of national interests it's minuscule.
Thanks to Ambassador Pickering. Thanks to Walter Robbins. Thank you to Sean Ade and the Institute of Public Diplomacy. We told you we'd get you out here. We will do that. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.